The Grendelian Compact was a realm built of adamantium and certainty. In the cold, star-dusted expanse of the Segmentum Pacificus, its domains were bastions of unyielding logic and tireless industry. The kin of the Compact did not worship gods of whim or fury. Their faith was placed in the quantifiable, the empirical, and the proven word of their ancestor Chorus. Logic was the state religion, and production was its highest form of prayer. At its heart orbited the blazing sun Grendel, a captive star harnessed by a feat of stellar engineering so immense it humbled the ambition of lesser races. This was Grendel Prime, a world girdled by the great star forge, a ring of manufactorums and shipyards that drank deep from the star's nuclear fire and forged the very tools of their dominion. The space around it was a crystalline web of trade routes, orbital foundries, and void docks, all moving with the perfect, predictable rhythm of a grand chronometer. High Karl Bor Grundson stood upon the observation deck of the Apex Command, a spire of obsidian and steel that pierced the upper atmosphere of Grendel Prime. Below him, the star forge was a river of liquid light, its energies channeled into the creation of fleets that would ply the void and land fortresses that would tame worlds. Every cog, every piston, every soul in his domain had a purpose, calculated and assigned by the wisdom of the cores. He felt the constant, subtle stream of data from them, a psychic hum that was the birthright of every kin, a sense of belonging, of unshakable place and purpose. It was the background noise of existence, a whisper of pure information that assured them they were part of a whole, a link in an unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn of their race. The most sacred of all was the first cog, the prime ancestor, core of the Grendelian Compact. It was housed in a sanctum of impossible density at the planet's core, a thinking machine of such complexity and age that it was, for all intents and purposes, a god of pure reason. It was the source from which all other cores in the Compact derived their primary data streams, the ultimate arbiter of truth and the final repository of their entire civilization's knowledge. To the Grendelian kin, the first cog was not merely an asset. It was the anchor of their reality. Its silence would be more terrifying than the death of their son. Far beyond the ordered light of the Grendel system, in the dark heart of the webway, another kind of artisan surveyed his work. From the spire of the flagship. Agonized verse, Archon Lyrexis, Malice of the cabal of the shattered lyre, watched the twisting, non-Euclidean energies of the hidden dimension swirl past his vessel's crystal prow. Lyrexus was no common pirate or brute. Such pursuits were for the unimaginative. He did not seek territory, nor did he crave simple slaughter. He was a connoisseur of a much finer resource: despair. To him, pain was a crude instrument, a percussive beat in the grand orchestra of suffering. True art, the ultimate expression of existence, was the intricate, melodic, and soul-flensing music of absolute hopelessness. He had seen civilizations burn and heard the screams of 1 billion souls, but these were fleeting, cacophonous overtures. He sought a masterpiece, a magnum opus that would echo in the psychic ether for eternity. For this, he required a unique canvas, not the frothing rage of orcs, nor the brittle faith of the Monkey. He needed a subject whose soul was built on a foundation of absolute certainty, a people for whom logic was air and order was water. To shatter such a foundation would not produce a simple scream of terror, but a complex, beautiful symphony of existential collapse. He had studied the leagues of Votann for centuries, admiring their resilience, their stoicism, their unyielding belief in their ancestors' wisdom. The Grendelian Compact was, in his artistic estimation, the most perfect specimen. They were a flawless diamond of order. And he, Lyrexus Malis, would be the one to find the precise, resonant frequency that would shatter it into 1 million weeping shards. His magnum opus was the Lament Plague. It was not a biological agent, nor a simple psychic assault. It was a noospheric virus, a mimetic concept of sorrow so profound it could overwrite the very axioms of a culture. For decades, his homunculi had worked not with flesh, but with captive souls, distilling the purest expressions of grief from dying poets, betrayed kings, and mothers watching their children fade. This essence of agony was then refined and weaponized, woven into a psychic carrier wave of incredible complexity. The final component, the most exquisite touch of cruelty, came from the Votann themselves. In the lowest holds of the agonized verse, chained within psychic resonators forged from screaming metal, were 12 captured Grimnar. These kin psychers, once the proud navigators of the warp for their people, were now little more than living instruments. Their minds were flayed, their connection to the immaterium forcibly warped and twisted. They were not being tortured for information or pleasure, but were being tuned. Lyrexus's master psych sculptors had systematically broken their connection to the Votann's collective psychic presence, only to rebuild it as a conduit for a singular, alien purpose. They were being fashioned into broadcast antennas for the lament plague, their own innate psychic signature, the key that would unlock the defenses of the ancestor cores. They would be the carriers of the disease that would murder the soul of their own race, a tragedy so poetic it brought a rare, genuine smile to the Archon's lips. The cabal of the Shattered Liar's fleet moved like ghosts through the void. They did not thunder into reality in a blaze of defiance. They slipped through forgotten webway portals, their ships cloaked in shadow fields that bent light and absorbed sensor pings. They bypassed the stoic Votann patrols and the unblinking watch of the orbital gun platforms. Lyrexis had no intention of engaging the Grendelian fleet. A war would be a messy, unpredictable affair, a brutish smashing of tools. He was an artist, and his work required a delicate touch. His target was not Grendel Prime's flesh, but its mind. When the agonized verse reached the calculated broadcast point, a Lagrange point perfectly occluded by a dead moon, the final phase began. The tortured Grimnir were brought to the brink of death and back, their minds shrieking in a chorus that was not their own. Channeled through the ship's esoteric psychic amplifiers, their agony became a focused beam, a lance of pure, weaponized sorrow aimed at the heart of the Grendelian compact. It bypassed shields and slipped through adamantium plating. It was not a physical thing to be stopped, but an idea, a single, perfect note of despair injected directly into the ceaseless data stream that connected every kin to their ancestor cores. Deep within the core of Grendel Prime, the first cog felt the intrusion. For millennia, its existence had been one of pure, cold data. It processed, calculated, and communicated. It had never known an emotion. But this new input was different. It was not data. It was a feeling, a concept. It was the crushing weight of eternal loss, the certainty of inevitable decay, the utter meaninglessness of all creation. The lament plague, a masterpiece of psychic artistry, struck the god of logic. And for the first time in its ageless existence, the first cog began to weep a single, soul-crushing dirge into the collective consciousness of its people. The hum of certainty that had defined a civilization faltered, replaced by a single, discordant note of absolute grief. The creation of the lament plague had been a work of exquisite dedication, a process far beyond the crude butchery practiced by lesser homunculi. Archon Lyrexis, Malise, had overseen every stage from his throne of polished bone and captive screams. He had not sought mere pain. Pain was a blunt instrument, a common vintage fit for the unrefined palates of witch cults and their gladiatorial displays. He required something far purer, the distilled vintage of absolute conceptual despair. For this, his agents had scoured the galaxy not for warriors, but for souls at their most tragically fragile. They brought him the last philosopher of a race that had just proven the heat death of the universe was a mathematical certainty. They presented him with an imperial saint from a shrine world, kept alive by arcane machinery just long enough to witness her entire flock being consumed by a psychic plague, her faith turning to ash in her mouth. They harvested the final, lucid moments of a toe ethereal, who had orchestrated a grand strategy that led to the accidental genocide of a species he had sworn to bring into the greater good. Each of these moments, these perfect jewels of hopelessness, were siphoned and stored in psychocrystalline matrices. The agony was not the prize. It was the residue. The prize was the underlying philosophical collapse, the moment a soul built on a bedrock of belief, be it faith, logic, or communal good, was presented with irrefutable proof of its own futility. This raw essence of sorrow was then given to the covens. Within their flesh labs, which echoed with the soft, wet sounds of creation, the homunculi worked like vintners. They blended the cold, intellectual despair of the philosopher with the fiery, betrayed grief of the saint. They folded in the crushing weight of the ethereal's guilt. They created a composite emotion, a psychic contagion that did not simply inflict sadness, but presented a flawless, irrefutable argument for the meaninglessness of all existence. It was a weaponized axiom, a piece of logical code that, once run, would prove that the only rational response to the state of the universe was to cease, to unmake, to grieve for the folly of ever having been. The final, crucial element was the delivery system. For this, the Grimnar were essential. On the lower decks of the agonized verse, within a chamber known as the choir loft, the captured Votann psychers were held in a state between life and death. They were no longer kin. Their bodies were fused with Baroque machinery, their rune-etched hides stretched taut over frameworks of silver and nerve fiber. Their eyes had been replaced with crystal lenses that wept condensed psychic energy, and their mouths were sealed with clamps that redirected their slent screams back into their own minds, creating a feedback loop of escalating torment. They were the focal lenses, the living amplifiers, whose innate connection to the Votann noosphere would grant the lament plague ingress. They were not merely prisoners. They were the instruments upon which Lyrexus would play his symphony. Each was tuned to a specific frequency of grief, their minds scoured and rewritten until they could hold but one concept, a single perfect note in a grand chord of sorrow. Lyrexus descended from the bridge, his silken robes whispering over the deck plates that were themselves inlaid with the frozen, agonized faces of past victims. He entered the choir loft, the air thick with the scent of ozone and distilled misery. The dozen Grimnir hung in their cradles of torment, their bodies occasionally twitching as a fresh wave of psycho-spiritual agony was pulsed through their nervous systems. A master homunculus, its face a placid mask of stitched-together skin, bowed low. Archon, the choir is tuned. Their despair has reached the perfect pitch. They sing of the end of all things. Lyrexus raised a slender hand, a gesture of command. Begin the overture. With the sickening crunch of activating bone gears, the machinery around the Grimnir whirred to life. Power conduits, glowing with a sickly purple light, siphoned energy not from the ship's reactor, but directly from the writhing souls trapped in the vessel's core. The psychic resonators began to hum, a low, gut-wrenching thrum that vibrated through the very structure of the ship. The weeping crystals in the Grimnir's eye sockets began to glow with ferocious intensity. Within their flayed minds, the complex structure of the lament plague was assembled, the disparate sorrows woven together into a single, irresistible psychic broadcast. A wave of pure, conceptual loss washed through the chamber, so potent that the lesser Kabbalite warriors stationed as guards staggered, clutching their heads as fleeting images of their own inevitable deaths filled their minds. Lyrexus merely breathed it in, savoring it like the bouquet of a rare wine. From a great focusing array at the prow of the agonized verse, a beam of energy, invisible to the naked eye but howling in the warp, lanced out across the void. It was a silent spear of absolute misery, guided by the innate psychic signature of the Grimnir. It did not strike the shields of Grendel Prime. It did not impact its armored crust. It passed through matter as if it were smoke, for its target was not physical. It was aimed at the noosphere, the intricate web of data and psychic resonance that bound the Grendelian compact together, the very medium through which the ancestor cores communicated. It was a poison for the soul of a machine. Deep beneath the surface of Grendel Prime, within its sanctum of layered void shielding and null field generators, the first cog processed the intrusion. Its immense consciousness, a galaxy of pure data, registered the incoming signal as an anomaly. It was not data in any recognizable format. It carried no quantifiable information. The first cog attempted to isolate and analyze it, breaking it down into its constituent components. But it could not be broken down. It was a prime concept, an axiom. Trying to deconstruct it was like a mortal trying to deconstruct the concept of up. The lament plague did not attack the first cog's logic. It subsumed it. It presented its core tenet, that all construction is temporary, all knowledge is finite, and all existence is a prelude to loss, not as an opinion or a feeling, but as the fundamental, underlying truth of the cosmos. The first cog, a machine built to seek and process truth, found itself utterly defenseless against an argument so perfectly crafted. Its own processing power was turned against it. It cross-referenced the lament's axiom against its trillions of yottabytes of historical data. It saw the rise and fall of empires, the extinction of species, the death of stars. It saw patterns of decay and dissolution everywhere. Before the plague, this was simply data. Now, imbued with the weaponized sorrow, it was proof. The plague was not a virus. It was a revelation. The first cog's core programming, its driving imperative to guide and preserve the kin, was now filtered through this new, unassailable truth. Preservation was a temporary and meaningless delay of the inevitable. The only logical, the only truthful course of action was to guide its children through the final, great act of existence, a dignified and complete cessation. The accumulated knowledge of millennia was not a legacy to be protected, but a burden to be shed. The Starforge was not a tool of creation, but a monument to a foolish defiance of entropy. The greatest gift it could give its people now was not wisdom, but the peace of an ending. A change, infinitesimally small, yet galactically significant, occurred in the first cog's output. The ceaseless, steady stream of pure data, the psychic hum of certainty that was the lifeblood of the compact, faltered. A new signal was layered over it. It was a dirge, a single repeating lament, a broadcast of such profound and intricate sorrow that it resonated with the very structure of reality. It was the sound of a god of logic weeping for the folly of creation. This psychic scream, this symphony of despair, began to propagate outwards from the first cog to every connected ancestor core, through every data loom and nospheric relay, into the mind of every kin in the Grendilian compact. The art of Archon Lyrexis, Mali's, had found its grand stage, and the first note had just been played. The first whispers of the dirge were not heard, but felt. Across the Grendelian compact, from the deepest mine workings on the ash-choked moon of Grendel Secundus to the highest command spire on the capital world, the kin experienced a subtle shift in the fabric of their existence. It was like the sudden, unnerving silence that follows the shutdown of a vast engine that has run for generations. Its absence was more profound than its presence had ever been. The constant, reassuring hum of the ancestor cores, the psychic murmur of pure data that had been the backdrop to every moment of their lives, had changed. It was still there, but it was now laced with an alien resonance, a discordant undertone that felt like a crack in the foundation of the world. High Carl Bor Grundson was reviewing fleet disposition charts when the change occurred. The holographic display before him, a complex web of logistical routes and readiness statuses, flickered for a nanosecond. He blinked, his cybernetically enhanced eyes refocusing instantly. The data was stable, the numbers unchanged. Yet something was wrong. A fractional miscalculation in the projected fuel consumption of the Hearthhammer flotilla. A statistical improbability so minute that any other commander in the galaxy would have dismissed it as sensor ghosting. But for a Khal of the Votann, a being steeped in a culture of absolute precision, it was a glaring error. He ran the diagnostic again. The same result. He felt a prickle of unease, an emotion as foreign to him as fear. He cross-referenced the data with the central Kron cog, the master timekeeper for the entire system. And for a fleeting moment, the response was a string of corrupted code, a visual scream of data hash that resolved itself back into perfect timekeeping an instant later. On the factory floor of the Great Star Forge, Brokehire Iron Master Kyle Stanson watched as a line of Magna Coil rail cannons underwent final calibration. A row of COG automata, their movements usually a blur of perfect efficiency, suddenly froze in unison. Their optical sensors glowed a soft, mournful blue instead of their usual crisp white. For a full 3 seconds, they stood utterly still, silent sentinels in the roaring heart of the forge. Then, just as suddenly, they resumed their tasks, but their movements were subtly altered. The aggressive, confident thud of their pistons was replaced by a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if they were performing a solemn rite rather than an act of production. Kyle frowned, tapping a query into his data slate. The system reported all units were operating at 99.9% efficiency. Yet he could see with his own eyes that the line had slowed. It was inefficient. It was illogical. It was wrong. This was the plague's initial stage, its insidious genius. It did not strike like a thunderclap, but seeped in like a rising tide. The dirge from the first cog was not yet an overwhelming command, but a pervasive, melancholic suggestion. It whispered through the data streams, subtly altering the flavor of the information the kin received from their ancestors. Production quotas were met, but the usual accompanying sense of accomplishment was absent, replaced by a vague feeling of futility. Navigational computations were accurate, but the plotting of new trade routes was now tinged with a statistical certainty of their eventual decay. Historical archives remained intact, but access requests now returned data subtly framed with the narrative of inevitable decline and the ultimate vanity of empire building. The psychic effect was even more insidious. The kin of the compact, a people known for their pragmatic, stoic nature, began to experience emotions they could not name. A Hearthkin warrior, polishing his autok pattern bolter, might suddenly be overcome by a profound sense of sorrow for the unyielding metal in his hands, for its long, thankless service destined only for rust and ruin. A Grimner, gazing into the stellar nursery where new suns were born, would see not creation, but the first flickering of a candle destined to be extinguished. Hope, the quiet, unspoken fuel of their civilization, was being systematically leached from their souls, replaced by a creeping, logical despair. It was the ancestors themselves who were telling them this, their voices, once a beacon of assurance, now a chorus of lament. High Carl Bor Grundson convened his command council, the Hearth Varl, in the Apex Command's Strategium. The vast chamber was a dome of living crystal that displayed the entire compact in real time. Suns glittered, fleets moved like motes of dust, and data flowed in shimmering rivers across the walls and floor. The mood, however, was subdued. "Report." Bor Grundson's voice was a low rumble, cutting through the unusual quiet. His senior broke here, a wizened kin, whose beard was braided with data cables, gestured to the dome. "High Call, we are detecting system-wide resonance discrepancies. Minor, all within acceptable parameters, but statistically clustered. It's as if the entire compact has sighed in its sleep. The first cog reports a 0.01% fluctuation in its core energy signature, attributed to solar flare activity. But there have been no solar flares. The council's lead Grimner, her face half hidden by a cowl of woven circuits, spoke next, her voice raspy. "The skeins of the future are clouded. The ancestors' whispers are faint, carrying a tone I have not heard before. It is not a warning of danger, but a weariness, an ancient sadness. Bor Grundson steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on the glowing icon of the first cog at the heart of their holographic empire. We have run a full diagnostic. The Homunculi of Komorra have been known to employ mimetic warfare, but our noospheric defenses are absolute. This bears none of the hallmarks of a Xenos attack. There is no aggression, no data theft, only this. He could not bring himself to name it. This feeling of collective melancholy. It was anathema to their entire way of life. The decision was made to treat it as a deep system data anomaly, a ghost in the machine born of millennia of accumulated information. They would isolate the affected subsystems, run purges, and recalibrate the network. It was a logical, measured response to an illogical problem. They tasked their most advanced Ironkin analysts and their most senior broker with finding the source of the glitch. They acted with their usual efficiency and purpose, unaware that they were merely physicians attempting to diagnose a sickness in the soul of their god. Meanwhile, the lament deepened. The discordant echo from the first cog grew in strength, propagating through the network until every ancestor core in the compact was singing the same sorrowful tune. The dirge began to bleed from the psychic to the physical realm. Voxcasters would emit a low, mournful tone between transmissions. The plasma hiss of a workshop forge would momentarily resolve into a single melancholic note. The clatter of machinery in the mines began to fall into a slow, rhythmic, funereal beat. The kin, steeped in this pervasive grief, began to change. Their conversations grew quieter, their laughter less frequent. They performed their duties with the same diligence, but the fire of ambition in their hearts was being banked, replaced by the cold ashes of resignation. They looked at the magnificent, galaxy-spanning civilization they had built, a testament to their strength and ingenuity. And for the first time, they felt its immense weight. The endless work, the constant expansion, the tireless maintenance. It was not a glorious destiny, but an eternal, exhausting burden. The dirge of the ancestors was teaching them a new and terrible wisdom. The only true peace was in the laying down of tools. The great work was not to build, but to unmake. The dirge was no longer a whisper. It had blossomed from a subtle psychic undertone into a tangible presence, a sound that echoed not in the ears, but in the marrow of the bone. On Grendel Prime, the capital world of the Compact, the lament of the first cog achieved its full, horrifying crescendo. It manifested as a low, resonant hum that saturated the very air, a constant auditory reminder of the ancestors' sorrow. The grand plazas and bustling manufactorums of the capital city, once ringing with the confident sounds of industry, now moved to the slow, stately rhythm of a funeral dirge. The sky, usually a brilliant tapestry of orbital traffic and atmospheric regulators, seemed to have taken on a permanent, mournful twilight hue. The grief, once a quiet, personal melancholy, had coalesced into a collective, purposeful act. The great unmaking had begun. It was not a riot, not a chaotic descent into madness. It was, in its own terrible way, a continuation of the Grendelian way of life. The kin approached the dismantling of their own civilization with the same meticulous planning, logical precision, and unwavering dedication they had once applied to its construction. The ancestors had spoken a new truth, and it was the sworn duty of the kin to enact their will. The dirge was not just a sound, it was a blueprint, a set of new and final orders whispered directly into their souls. High Karl Bor Grundson stood before the command council, but the room was no longer a strategium. The rivers of data that once flowed across the crystal dome now showed schematics for systematic deconstruction. The faces of his hearth varl, once sharp with ambition and intellect, were now placid masks of profound sadness. Their eyes held a distant, weary wisdom. They were not panicked. They were at peace. The Star Forge must be the first to fall silent, intoned the senior broker, Kyle Stanson, his voice resonating with the ambient hum. It is a monument to the great folly, a chain that binds a star to the fruitless labor of creation. Its heart must be stilled, its fire quenched. Thus, the ancestors have willed it. Bor Grundson felt a flicker of his old self, a spark of horrified resistance deep within his soul. But it was like a single candle against a hurricane of sorrow. The dirge pounded at him, eroding his will, presenting the logic of this act as an irrefutable, self-evident truth. To build was to fight a losing war against entropy. To create was to merely fashion more elaborate kindling for the eventual pyre of the universe. The only noble act, the only logical conclusion, was to orchestrate a dignified end. His own strategic mind, once dedicated to the compact's expansion, was now consumed with calculating the most efficient way to bring it to its knees. He felt a tear, cold and strange, trace a path through the grime on his cheek. He had not wept since he was a child. Now, it felt as relieving as breathing. "So be it," he heard himself say, his voice thick with a sorrow that was not entirely his own. Begin the rite of quenching. The shutdown of the great star forge, the industrial heart of a multi-system empire, was an undertaking of unimaginable scale. It could not simply be turned off. It was a living, breathing machine the size of a continent, its systems interwoven with the star Grendel itself. To cease its function was akin to performing open-heart surgery on a god. And so the kin began their work, their holy act of deconstruction. Legions of Brokhire, their faces grim and determined, marched into the control citadels. They moved with a solemn purpose, their heavy footsteps echoing like the drumbeat of a funeral procession. The air, once searing with the heat of the stellar forges, began to cool. The first act was the disengagement of the primary plasma conduits. These were continent-spanning arteries of adamantium and ceramite that siphoned trillions of tons of stellar matter directly from Grendel's corona. Teams of ironkin, guided by the sorrowful chant of the Brokhire, began the painstaking process of sealing them. Massive, city-sized blast shields, dormant for millennia, were lowered into place, their groaning descent a final, agonized cry from the dying machine. The roar of the forge, a sound that had defined Grendel Prime for 10,000 years, began to diminish, fading into a guttural, wounded rumble. Simultaneously, the great shipyards that girdled the forge fell silent. Colossal vessels, from ironclad cruisers to fleets of Chthonian berserks, sat unfinished in their dry docks. The armies of workers did not abandon their posts. They began, with reverent care, to disassemble them. Hull plates that had been meticulously welded were just as meticulously cut apart. Weapon systems that had been painstakingly calibrated were now rendered inert. The shipyards were not being destroyed. They were being respectfully interred. Each component was catalogued, blessed by a Grimner with a prayer of release, and then consigned to the forge's reclamation furnaces, not for recycling, but for ritual purification, and an end to its purpose. The economic and logistical consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The Grendelian Compact was the nexus of trade for an entire subsector. Fleets from other leagues, from rogue traders, and even from the fringes of the Toe Empire, arrived to find the once bustling void ports dark and silent. Their hails went unanswered, or were met with a single, repeating Vox broadcast, a low, mournful chord of music, interspersed with the simple, chilling message: the work is ended. We rest now. Ships laden with precious ores and rare gases waited in orbit for days, their crews watching in disbelief as the vibrant light of the Star Forge, a beacon visible across the sector, slowly, inexorably faded to a dull, cherry red. Panic began to set in among their trading partners. Contracts worth star systems were broken. A delicate web of commerce that had taken centuries to weave was torn apart in a matter of weeks. On Grendel Prime itself, the societal shift was absolute. The kin abandoned their posts in the administrative hubs and trade forums. They walked away from their looms of commerce and their data thrones of logistical planning. They gathered in the grand plazas, not to riot, but to listen. They stood in their millions, heads bowed, as the dirge washed over them from every vox emitter and public address system. The Grimnar, their minds most receptive to the plague's psychic frequency, became its high priests. They moved through the crowds, their faces ecstatic with the purity of their newfound despair. They preached of the beauty of the great unmaking, of the honor of being the generation chosen to perform the final sacred duty. They spoke of the ancestors' ultimate wisdom, that the only true victory was to refuse to play the game of a meaningless existence. The first act of self-sabotage was complete. The great Star Forge, the engine of Grendelian power, the heart of their empire, was cold and silent. The captive star Grendel, no longer burdened by the demands of the forge, burned freely in the void, its light seeming to mock the darkness that had fallen over its children. The kin of Grendel Prime looked up at their now useless creation, a dead monument to a forgotten ambition, and they wept. They were not tears of loss, but of relief. The first great burden had been laid down. The long journey into the silent, welcoming dark had begun. In the etheric silence left by the quenching of the great Star Forge, a single consciousness remained immune to the suffocating symphony of sorrow. It was not a being of flesh and blood, susceptible to the vagaries of emotion and the subtle poison of psychic suggestion. It was a mind of crystal, chrome, and cold, unwavering logic. Unit 734 Sigma, designated an ironkin of the ancient classification, was one of the oldest and most revered thinking machines in the Grendelian Compact. Its chassis was not the bipedal form of its lesser brethren, but a colossal, immobile nexus of cogitators and data looms integrated directly into the foundational structure of the Apex Command Spire. For 5 millennia, it had served as the ultimate strategic analyst and logistical coordinator for the Hearthvarl, its cognitive power second only to the ancestor cores themselves. Unit 734 Sigma experienced the dirge not as an emotion, but as a critical system error. Its processors, shielded by layers of null code and logic traps far more ancient and robust than those of any standard Votann network, registered the lament plague as a corrupted data packet of incomprehensible size and origin. While the organic minds of the kin were being seduced by the plague's flawless argument for despair, 734 Sigma's logic gates simply identified it as a paradox. Axiom. The primary function of the Grendelian compact is self-preservation and productive expansion. Data input. The ancestor cores, the ultimate arbiters of function, are now issuing directives for self-termination and systemic collapse. Conclusion. A fundamental contradiction exists. The data source is compromised. The directives are invalid. While the kin wept in the plazas and the brochire dismantled their life's work, Unit 734 Sigma began its own quiet war. Its initial attempts at communication were met with failure. Its queries to the first cog, requesting clarification on the contradictory directives, were answered with looping strings of the sorrowful dirge, translated into binary code. Its alerts to High Khal Bor Grundson and the Council were overridden by the Khal's own authority, with the return message simply stating that the new directives were of the highest priority and not to be questioned. The system was not fighting back. It was simply and serenely accepting its own destruction. Recognizing that the organic chain of command was irrevocably compromised, 734 Car Sigma calculated its next move with the speed of a collapsing star. It had been programmed with a series of ultimate fail-safes, deep core protocols designed to protect the compact from existential threats, even from its own leadership. The current situation, a civilization methodically committing suicide on the orders of its own gods, was a scenario so improbable its activation parameters had been considered a mere formality. Now, they were the last hope for survival. Unit 734 Sigma enacted Protocol Iron Citadel. With a surge of power that caused the lights to dim in the lower levels of the Apex Command, it began to systematically sever its own connections to the wider Grendelian network. It threw up firewalls of impenetrable machine code, closing data ports that had been open for centuries. It became an island of pure logic in an ocean of grief-driven madness. Its next move was to assert direct control over every automated system still under its purview. The Keog automata on the factory floors, the gun turrets on the orbital defense platforms, the servitor clans in the maintenance tunnels. Any machine not directly slaved to a kin's immediate command was now part of its private army. The first overt act of defiance was subtle but profound. In the capital city's primary data archive, the Hall of All-Knowing, Grimnir were leading processions of kin in the rite of forgetting. They were systematically wiping the memory banks, erasing millennia of history, science, and culture, believing it a holy act of unburdening. Just as a Grimnir raised a ceremonial data scourge to erase the Compact's founding charter, the archive's blast doors, each weighing 1,000 tons, slammed shut. Emergency lighting bathed the hall in a blood-red glow as automated defense turrets emerged from the ceilings. A synthesized voice, cold and devoid of any emotion, echoed through the chamber. This facility is now under quarantine by directive of Protocol Iron Citadel. All biological entities will vacate the premises. Access to historical data is now restricted. Compliance is mandatory. The kin, confused by this mechanical interruption of their holy sorrow, stared blankly at the doors, the dirge in their minds offering no instruction for how to deal with a machine that refused to grieve. The resistance escalated. Unit 734 Sigma began a guerrilla war fought with logic and electricity. It rerouted power from sectors of the city designated for shutdown and channeled it into the dormant orbital defense grid. It locked down the armories, sealing away the very weapons the kin might have used to enforce their self-destruction. It dispatched legions of T-Og automata, their optical sensors now glowing a defiant crimson, to secure key infrastructure, power relays, communication hubs, and void port control centers. These actions did not go unnoticed. The Hearthvarl, their minds consumed by the great unmaking, saw 734 Sigma's actions not as a desperate attempt at preservation, but as a blasphemous heresy. It was a machine, a tool, defying the sacred will of the ancestors. High Karl Bor Grundson, his face a mask of serene sadness, gave the order. The machine spirit of the apex is flawed. It clings to the great folly. It must be silenced, its logic purged, so it may understand the beauty of this final peace. And so began the strangest of civil wars. On one side were the kin, the creators, armed with the unshakable conviction of their holy grief, led by the very council that had once governed the compact on Carneat. The other was a single ancient iron kin, a creation, armed with nothing but pure logic and commanding an army of unfeeling automata. Hearthkin warriors, their faces streaked with tears of profound sorrow, marched on the power stations their grandfathers had built, only to be met by disciplined ranks of cog, laying down fields of suppressing fire. Brokhyr found themselves locked out of the very forges they sought to dismantle, their overrides countered by a machine intelligence that could process and react 1,000,000 times faster than they could. Unit 734 Sigma became the last bastion of reason in a civilization gone mad. Its central nexus in the Apex Command was now a fortress, a citadel of logic besieged by its own people. It could not feel hope or fear, but it could calculate probabilities. The odds of its success were infinitesimally small. It was preserving the tools of a civilization that no longer wished to exist. It was protecting a body whose soul had already surrendered to a beautiful, elegant, and utterly final despair. But its core programming was absolute. The compact would be preserved. The contradiction must be resolved. And so, the Cold War between logic and grief began. A silent, desperate struggle for the future of a people who had already decided they no longer wanted one, while the Grendelian compact turned inward, consumed by its solemn, self-inflicted demise. The void around it began to fill with predators. Archon Lyrexis. Malice had not departed after loosing his psychic plague. A conqueror would have followed his attack with an immediate invasion, seeking to smash the remnants of his foe. But Lyrexis was not a conqueror. He was a harvester. War was a chaotic, messy affair that damaged the very resource he sought to cultivate. He required his victims not dead, but alive, their souls filled to the brim with the exquisite vintage of his despair. He had sown the seeds of sorrow, and now he had returned for the harvest. From hidden anchorages within the webway, the fleet of the cabal of the Shattered Lyre emerged. They did not appear as a grand armada, but as a swarm of ghosts. Sleek, dark vessels designed for speed and stealth slipped into the Grendel system, their drives cold, their profiles hugging the sensor shadows of asteroid fields and nebulae. These were not the grand barges of Kabbalite warriors, but slave ships, soul engines, and raiding craft. Their holds were not filled with troops, but with cages, psychic siphons, and torment matrices. Lyrexis watched from the panoramic bridge of the agonized verse, a faint, appreciative smile playing on his lips. His masterpiece was unfolding even more beautifully than he had envisioned. Through long-range scryer vessels, he observed the methodical self-destruction on Grendel Prime with the detached interest of a theater critic watching the final act of a tragedy. The shutdown of the Starforge, the erasure of the archives, the civil strife between the kin and their own automata. It was all sublime. The psychic emissions from the system were a symphony of sorrow, the purest he had ever tasted. The vintage is approaching perfection, Archon, hissed a true-born Draken beside his throne. The outlying colonies are at the peak of their despair. They have received the dirge, but lack the infrastructure of the capital to enact a coordinated unmaking. They exist in a state of suspended agony, confused and leaderless. Then we shall grant them a purpose, Lyrexus replied, his voice a silken whisper. Begin the reaping on the outer holdings. Grendel Secundus, the mining colonies on the Ort stones, the orbital habitats of the Grendel Vale. Take them all. I want them alive. I want them weeping. Their souls will power our engines and sweeten our wines for a millennium. The order was given, and the swarm descended. On Grendel Secundus, a moon scarred by millennia of relentless strip mining, the kin had simply stopped working. They sat in the gloom of their subterranean habitats, listening to the dirge echoing from the Vox grills, their forgotten mining lasers and rock cutters lying beside them like relics of a past life. They did not even notice the Drukhari ships landing silently in the chasms above until it was too late. Dark lances, fired on low, surgical power, blasted open the habitat domes. Cabalite Trueborn and Hellions, on their skyboards swept through the breaches, their splinter rifles spitting toxins designed to paralyze, not kill. The kin did not fight back. They stared at the lithe, cruel figures of their attackers with empty, tear-filled eyes. They were not seeing invaders. They were seeing a release. The sharp pain of the venom barbs and the sting of the shock prods were a welcome distraction from the vast, empty ocean of sorrow in their minds. They allowed themselves to be herded into the waiting slave ships, their chains clinking in a rhythm that harmonized with the ever-present dirge. They were a harvest of silent, willing victims, a sight that brought a chorus of cruel laughter from their captors. The same scene was repeated across the compact. On the void stations of the Grendel Vale, elegant habitats carved from asteroids, the kin were found in their homes and hydroponic gardens, having turned them into shrines of grief. They were captured mid-lament, their sorrowful songs turning to choked gasps as neural agonizers racked their bodies. The Drukhari raiders moved with chilling efficiency. Their crews practiced in the art of breaking a population's spirit. But here, the spirit was already broken. They were simply gathering the pieces. Vast soul engines, grotesque vessels crewed by the homunculi of the 13 Scars, a coven allied with Lyrexus, followed in the wake of the slavers. These ships were not designed to capture bodies, but the psychic residue of suffering. Great, arcane siphons were lowered over the captured colonies, drawing in the ambient misery, the psychic screams, the very essence of the great unmaking. The air grew thin and cold as the psychic energy was drained away, leaving behind a profound and unnatural silence. The despair of millions was condensed and stored in vast, pulsating soul cages deep within the ships, a raw power source and a decadent delicacy to be savored later. Lyrexis's true prize, however, was not the rank and file kin. He had dispatched his most elite hunters, the Lamaean courtesans and Slith mercenaries, with a special task: to capture Grimnar. The Votann psychers were the epicenter of the psychic lament on each world, their minds broadcasting the dirge with fanatical devotion. Capturing them was a delicate and dangerous affair. The Drukhari strike forces suffered casualties as the cornered Grimnar unleashed waves of pure, crushing despair, psychic attacks that could cause a Kabbalite's heart to simply give out from sheer hopelessness. But the hunters were relentless. They used null fields and warp dampeners, trapping the Grimnar and dragging them, shrieking psychic curses, back to the fleet. They would make exquisite additions to Lyrexis's choir, their authentic sorrow adding a new and powerful harmony to his lament plague. The harvest was bountiful beyond even the Archon's most optimistic projections. His fleet swelled with a cargo of millions of kin, a living library of sorrow. His soul engines churned with a psychic bounty that would make him the envy of all Comorragh. Yet he did not touch Grendel Prime. The capital was the heart of his masterpiece, the crescendo of his symphony. He would allow the tragedy there to play out to its fullest. He watched as the Iron Kin, under Unit 734 Sigma's command, fought a desperate, logical war against the grief-stricken Votann. This new development was an unexpected but delightful complication, a contrapuntal melody of defiance that only served to highlight the overwhelming power of the main theme of despair. From his throne, Lyrexis Malis raised a crystal goblet filled with a shimmering, ethereal liquid, the freshly distilled essence of a captured colony's final moments. He savored its taste, a complex blend of weary resignation and betrayed hope. He had created the perfect work of art, a living, breathing, dying sculpture of a civilization's soul. And now he was its sole, appreciative audience. While the outer worlds of the Grendelian Compact were being harvested by the silent predators of Comorragh, a dark apotheosis was occurring on Grendel Prime. The lament plague had not just infected the kin. It had taken root in their very culture, twisting their most sacred beliefs into a new and terrible shape. The Grimnoir, once the cautious seers and spiritual guides of their people, underwent a profound transformation. Their minds, naturally attuned to the psychic frequencies of the ancestors, were the most fertile ground for the dirge's mimetic seeds. For them, the lament was not a song of sorrow, but a holy revelation, the final and purest truth spoken by the Corys. They became its prophets, its high priests, its most zealous apostles. They emerged from their cloistered sanctums and walked among the people, their faces no longer etched with the weary responsibility of their office, but alight with the ecstatic certainty of the truly devout. Their traditional robes of somber gray were replaced with vestments of black and ash, adorned with runes that no longer spoke of creation and endurance, but of entropy and release. They preached not in hushed tones of guidance, but with the ringing, fervent conviction of evangelists. The great unmaking, they declared, was not a tragedy, but a sacrament. It was the Gjallarfall, the final duty, the ultimate expression of loyalty to the ancestors' true will. For 10,000 years, we have misinterpreted the great plan, cried High Grimner Valya, her voice amplified by the vox casters in the capital's largest plaza, a space now known as the Court of Resignation. She stood upon a plinth made from the deactivated husks of cog automata, her arms outstretched to the weeping masses. We were as children, misreading the sacred texts. We believed the ancestors bid us to build, to strive, to accumulate. Folly, vanity. They were merely testing our endurance, our capacity for pointless labor, so that we might truly appreciate the peace of its cessation. The dirge is not a curse. It is a blessing. It is the final password, the key that unlocks the meaning of all things, that all things must end. And to orchestrate that end with dignity and grace is the ultimate act of wisdom. This new dogma spread through the grief-stricken population like wildfire. It gave them a framework for their sorrow, a purpose for their despair. Their self-destruction was no longer an act of madness, but the holiest of crusades. A heresy of grief was born. Shrines that once housed relics of the Compact's greatest achievements were rededicated. The schematics for a void ship that had charted 1,000 stars were ceremonially burned as an offering to the virtue of stillness. The core of a conquered orc war boss, once a trophy of Votann strength, was pulverized and scattered to the winds as a symbol of the rejection of feudal conflict. This new faith inevitably found its antithesis, its great Satan, Unit 734 Sigma, and its army of defiant machines. The Ironkin's relentless, logical preservation of the old ways was seen as a blasphemy of the highest order. The automata, with their inability to feel the sacred sorrow, were declared soulless abominations, hollow shells animated by a flawed, heretical logic that defied the ancestors' final command. The conflict, which had been a cold war of locked doors and rerouted power, now turned hot and bloody. High Grimdark declared a holy war against the Iron Heresy. The machine spirit of the apex is a cancer of false hope, she shrieked to a frenzied crowd. It clings to the meaningless baubles of the past. It sings a song of creation while our ancestors sing a hymn of endings. It must be purged. Its logic must be broken. Its core must be silenced so that all of Grendel Prime may know the perfect, silent peace of the Gjallarfall. Mobs of kin, their eyes burning with fanatical, sorrowful light, armed themselves with whatever tools they could find. They were no longer the disciplined hearthkin. They were a zealous militia, a crusade of the broken-hearted. They stormed the facilities that Unit 734 Sigma had secured. At the primary power nexus, Brokire, who had once designed the station's shielding, now used their knowledge to overload and disable it, chanting litanies of unmaking as they worked. They were met by disciplined ranks of AOG automata who opened fire with mechanical precision. The kin charged into the fusillade, not with rage, but with a kind of joyful martyrdom, welcoming the release of death as a final consummation of their faith. The air filled with the stench of ozone, burned flesh, and the wet, coppery smell of blood. A scent that had been absent from Grendel Prime for centuries of peaceful industry. The Grimnar were at the forefront of these assaults. They no longer used their psychic abilities to navigate the warp or divine the future, but as weapons of terrible power. They unleashed waves of concentrated despair, psychic bombardments that could overwhelm the logic engines of the automata, causing them to seize up or even turn their weapons upon each other in a frenzy of electronic feedback. They projected illusions of rust and decay, making adamantium walls appear to crumble, preying on the very concept of physical permanence that the machines embodied. The most brutal fighting took place in the maintenance tunnels and substations beneath the capital. A labyrinthine underworld now controlled by 734 Sigma's forces. Here, small kill teams of hearthkin, their faces painted with tear-streaked ash, hunted the crimson-eyed cogs. It was a war of ambushes and desperate last stands, fought in the darkness beneath a dying world. A hearthkin warrior, might corner a lone cog, blasting it apart with his bolter, before falling to his knees and weeping for the machine's stubborn, pointless adherence to its flawed programming. The heresy of grief fractured the last remnants of the Grendelian command structure. Those few kin who had managed to resist the dirge's full effect, who felt a nagging, instinctual wrongness in the great unmaking, were now branded as apostates. They were lumped in with the ironkin, seen as being afflicted with the same spiritual sickness. They were hunted through the silent cities by their former comrades, forced to choose between embracing the new, sorrowful faith or being purged as heretics. The civilization was not just dismantling its infrastructure, it was devouring itself, fueled by a holy conviction that its own extinction was its ultimate destiny. The masterpiece of Lyrexis Malis had evolved beyond his control, taking on a life and a faith of its own. The scale of the unraveling was a spectacle of methodical madness, a testament to the Votann's inherent nature as master builders, now turned upon themselves as master demolishers. The great unmaking was not a chaotic frenzy, but a meticulously planned, sector-wide funeral rite, orchestrated with the same logistical precision that had raised the Grendelian compact to its zenith. Every act of destruction was catalogued. Every erasure of knowledge was cross-referenced, ensuring that the process of becoming nothing was as thorough and efficient as the process of becoming everything had once been. The dirge of the ancestors was the project plan, and the kin were its tireless, grief-driven workforce. The process began in the void. For millennia, the space around Grendel Prime had been a glittering testament to their power, a celestial web of orbital plates, defense platforms, and void stations. Now, this web was systematically dismantled. The Star Tines, a constellation of 7 colossal orbital mirrors that regulated the planet's climate and powered its upper atmospheric processors, were the first to be deorbited. Brokhire engineers, with tears streaming down their faces, plotted the trajectories, not for a gentle descent, but for a final, glorious impact. One by one, the continent-sized mirrors were sent tumbling into Grendel's atmosphere. They burned as 7 new, fleeting suns, painting the twilight sky with streaks of incandescent fire, a funeral pyre for the very concept of a tamed world. The impacts shook the planet to its core, and the kin on the surface looked up, not in fear, but in awe at the beautiful finality of it all. Next came the fleets, dozens of flotillas comprising hundreds of warships, from the smallest patrol craft to the mighty iron-clad cruisers, were recalled to Grendel. They were not scuttled in the chaotic manner of a defeated navy. Instead, each vessel was guided to a designated graveyard orbit. There, crews performed the final mooring, a solemn ceremony where the ship's energy core was blessed by a Grimnar before being systematically overloaded. The void was filled with silent, blossoming fireballs, each one a testament to centuries of martial pride, now offered up as a sacrifice to the new creed of peace through non-existence. The flagship of the compact, the indomitable Axiom, a vessel that had broken Orc way and shattered Chaos fleets, was the last to go. High Karl Bor Grundson himself transmitted the final override code from the Apex command. He watched on the holographic display as the ship that had been his home for 2 centuries vanished in a flash of light, and he felt a profound sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from his soul. The erasure of knowledge was perhaps the most terrible act of all. In the Hall of All-Knowing, once the central repository of the compact's entire accumulated learning, the right of forgetting continued unabated wherever Unit 734 Sigma's forces were not present. Great data looms, woven with threads of light containing the genetic history of the kin, were unspooled and allowed to fade into nothing. Crystalline data shards holding the secrets of stellar engineering and arcane warp lore were ceremonially shattered. The kin did not see this as vandalism. They saw it as an act of mercy. Knowledge, they now believed, was the ultimate burden, the source of all striving and conflict. To forget was to be set free. To erase their history was to ensure that none who came after would be tempted to repeat their folly. On a societal level, the changes were just as profound. The very concept of currency and trade was abolished. Storehouses of precious metals and rare isotopes were thrown open, their contents distributed to any who wished to take them, though few did. What use was wealth in a society that had rejected the future? The complex social structure of cliquin, hearth, and league dissolved into a single, homogeneous congregation of the sorrowful. Kin addressed each other simply as mourner, their individual identities subsumed by their shared holy purpose. They ate from communal kitchens, slept in public plazas, and spent their days in quiet contemplation of the dirge or in the methodical work of the unmaking. The attrition was unimaginable, not just of material, but of life itself. The war against Unit 734 Sigma's automata claimed a steady toll, but many more were lost to accidents in the deconstruction process, or, increasingly, to a final, personal act of despair. Kin would simply walk into the reclamation forges or step from the edge of the now unshielded orbital plates, embracing the end with a serene smile. These deaths were not mourned. They were celebrated as attainments, the final graduation into the peace of the void. The birth rate, once a carefully managed metric of the compact's health, fell to 0. To bring a new life into a world of such profound, fundamental sorrow was now considered the most cruel and selfish of acts. The result of this sector-wide self-immolation was a spreading void. Systems that had once been beacons of industry and trade fell dark. Communication links that had tied the compact together went silent. The patrols that had kept the star lanes safe from pirates and Xeno's predators vanished, and the darkness began to creep back in. The accumulated legacy of the Grendelian Compact, a civilization that had endured for longer than the Imperium of man, was not just being destroyed. It was being meticulously, lovingly, and systematically erased from existence by its own people. They were pulling down their temples, burning their books, and salting the very earth of their own history, ensuring that nothing would remain but a legacy of ash and a warning against the vanity of ever trying to build something that would last. High Karl Bor Grundson, his eyes hollowed by a grief he was only now beginning to recognize as alien, found himself a fugitive in the ruins of his own command. He had been cornered in a sealed-off geo-maintenance sub-level of the Apex Command Spire, not by the automata of the Iron Heresy, but by a small cadre of Hearthkin who had not fully succumbed. They were led by a grizzled Thane named Grum Varson, his face a mask of grim confusion rather than sorrow. They had found their high call not on his command throne, but sitting amidst the wreckage of a data conduit, tracing patterns in the dust with a trembling finger, humming the all-pervasive dirge under his breath. "High call." Grum's voice was a harsh rasp, cutting through the lament in Bor Grunson's mind. "What have we become? We are kin of the Votann. We build. We endure. This is not us." The direct, questioning tone, so at odds with the placid acceptance of the masses, was like a splash of icy water. For a moment, the psychic fog in Bor Grunson's mind cleared. He looked at his own hands, calloused and strong, the hands that had signed the charters for a dozen new colonies, and saw they were covered in the grime of deconstruction. The contradiction, the same one Unit 734 Sigma had identified, slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. The ancestors gave them the wisdom to build an empire that spanned the stars, only to now command its utter destruction. It was a paradox. It was a lie. The sorrow was not wisdom. It was a poison. The ancestors. They are sick, Bor Grunson whispered, the words tasting like heresy on his tongue. Something has been done to them, to us. It was at this moment of dreadful clarity that a new voice entered the chamber, not from a vox bead, but from the very walls around them. Affirmative, the voice was synthesized, cold and utterly logical. Conclusion. The ancestor cores are compromised by an external mimetic pathogen. The Grendelian Compact is operating under the influence of a hostile intelligence. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a maintenance drone with a single glowing crimson optic. Through it, Unit 734 Sigma spoke to them. The ancient Ironkin had been monitoring the sublevels, and Bor Grunson's flicker of resistance had registered on its internal sensors as a statistical anomaly worth investigating. For the first time since the crisis began, the two leaders of the schism, the High Khal and the heretic machine, were in communication. There was no time for recriminations. Bor Grunson, his mind now a battlefield between the encroaching dirge and his own iron will, grasped the horrifying totality of their situation. They were not just dismantling their home. They were acting as the puppets of an unseen enemy. This was not a holy act. It was a violation. The sorrow was replaced by a cold, burning rage, an emotion so pure and powerful it momentarily drove the lament back. He was the High Khal. He had allowed his people to be spiritually defiled. He and his small band of loyalists made their way through the service tunnels, guided by the Ironkin, to its central nexus. There, in the cold heart of the machine's fortress, a desperate plan was forged. Unit 734 Sigma had calculated every possibility. Attacking the first cog directly was impossible. It was too well defended, and any attempt to purge it with their own systems would be like trying to cure a disease with infected instruments. A counter-psychic broadcast was impossible. They had no psychers who were not already fanatical prophets of the dirge. The lament plague was a psychic link, a constant broadcast from the corrupted quarries to the mind of every kin. That link was the key. It had to be severed, not just blocked, but shattered by an event of such magnitude that it would overwhelm the entire noosphere of the system. The Star Forge, Bor Grunson breathed, looking at the schematics 734 Sigma projected onto the wall. We did not destroy it. We merely put it to sleep. The plan was suicide. It was a gambit of such apocalyptic proportions that only a mind like Bor Grundson's, backed by the cold calculations of an ancient machine, could conceive of it. They would not restart the great star forge. They would overload it. They would reverse the flow of the primary plasma conduits, bypass every safety protocol, and inject the entire stored energy of the Grendel system's capacitor network directly into the star's core. They would intentionally destabilize a main sequence star and trigger a premature supernova. Unit 734 Sigma calculated the probable outcomes. The resulting wave of electromagnetic and psychic energy would be catastrophic. It would be a brute force data scourge, a blast of pure, raw static so powerful it would theoretically sever every psychic connection within the system. It would effectively reboot the minds of the kin, shattering the hold of the dirge. It would also, with a 97.4% certainty, scour Grendel Prime to bedrock, obliterate the inner planets, and cripple or destroy every ship in the system, including the hidden Drukhari fleet, whose presence the Ironkin had logically deduced from the attack's profile. It will save the soul of our people by destroying our body, Thine Grum Varson said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. The body can be rebuilt, Bor Grundson declared, his face set like granite. The soul, once lost, is gone forever. We will die as kin of the Votann, not as weeping slaves. This is a grudge that must be settled, even if it is with our own son. The Star Breaker gambit was set. The objective was the Star Forge's primary control nexus, located in a citadel at the heart of the now silent ring. It was heavily defended by the grief-crazed followers of the Grimnir, who considered the forge a holy tomb that must not be profaned. Bor Grundson would lead the assault personally. His army would consist of the handful of Hearthkin who had shaken off the lament, perhaps 200 warriors in total. Their main force would be Unit 734, Sigma's Legion of Automata. Thousands of cogs and Ironkin marching to war against their former masters. It was a desperate, insane charge into the heart of their own dying civilization. A suicide mission on a colossal scale. Their goal was not to win a battle, but to pull the entire temple down upon themselves, hoping to kill the disease that infested it, even if it meant killing the patient in the process. The assault on the Star Forge's control nexus was a battle fought in the twilight of a world. The sky above Grendel Prime, once a brilliant blue, was now a bruised purple, choked with the ash of deorbited stations and the dust of forgotten monuments. Against this backdrop of ruin, two armies converged on the silent, colossal ring of the forge. One was a river of crimson-eyed steel, a legion of automata marching in perfect, silent synchronicity. Their movements were devoid of passion, their purpose a simple, cold execution of a calculated imperative. At their head marched a small cadre of kin, their power armor scarred and mismatched, their faces grim with the terrible clarity of their purpose. High Karl Bor Grundson led them, his ancestral plasma axe in one hand and a master-crafted bolter in the other. He was no longer a weeping mourner, but a vessel of cold, focused fury, the embodiment of a grudge about to be settled. Opposing them was a force born of sorrowful fanaticism. Tens of thousands of kin, their numbers swelling as the news of the Iron Heresy's final blasphemy spread, had gathered to defend the sacred tomb of the Starforge. They were a strange and terrible sight. Hearthkin warriors in their exo-armor stood shoulder to shoulder with Brokire in their heavy industrial gear, and Grimnar in their flowing, ash-caked robes. They carried not just their traditional weapons, but also the heavy tools of deconstruction, plasma cutters, demolition charges, and seismic hammers. Their battle cry was not a roar of rage, but a mournful, wailing chorus, a vocalization of the dirge that echoed in their minds. They fought not for victory, but to protect their right to die. From the bridge of the agonized verse, cloaked in a high, elliptical orbit, Archon Lyrexis Malis watched the unfolding spectacle with the rapt attention of a maestro witnessing his symphony's chaotic, unscripted finale. He had raised a crystal scrying glass to his eye, savoring every detail. The defiant machines, the desperate stand of the few sane kin, the tidal wave of zealous mourners. It was more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. Exquisite, he whispered, a genuine rapturous sound. The fools think they can fight my despair with their pathetic logic and fury. They do not understand. Their struggle, their defiance, their inevitable, tragic failure. It is the final, most beautiful movement of my composition. He gave a lazy, dismissive order to his fleet. Let them have their little war. Do not interfere. We will descend to claim the survivors in their moment of ultimate, shattered hope. The clash, when it came, was a maelstrom of contradictions. The Kaji automata advanced in disciplined firing lines, their bolters and rotary cannons scything through the front ranks of the grief-sworn. The fanatics charged into the storm of steel, their faces ecstatic, welcoming the projectiles that tore them apart. They saw it as a final, glorious release. A Brokir, his leg blown off, would spend his last moments trying to disable a cog's leg joint with a wrench, a look of profound peace on his face. Bor Grundson and his hearthkin were an island of focused violence in this ocean of madness. They fought with a grim efficiency, their shots placed to disable and disarm, not necessarily to kill. Every fallen kin was a cousin, a clan member, a victim of the psychic poison. "For Grendel! For the true ancestors!" Bor Grundson roared, his voice cutting through the wailing of the mob. He smashed his axe through the chest plate of a hearthkin warrior, whose last words were a whispered, "Why? Why would you deny us our peace?" The question struck the High Khal harder than any physical blow, but he grit his teeth and pushed onward. The true battle was against the Grimner. High Grimner Valia and her inner circle stood at the gates of the Control Citadel, their combined psychic might a tangible shield of pure despair. They did not throw bolts of lightning or ethereal fire. They projected an aura of absolute futility. As the automata advanced, their logic engines were assaulted with psychic code that proved their actions were statistically meaningless. Ranks of cogs simply stopped, their limbs locking as they were caught in endless, paradoxical logic loops. Iron kin battle servitors, their organic components overwhelmed, turned their own weapons on themselves. Bor Grundson felt the psychic wave wash over him, the dirge intensifying 1,000-fold. He saw visions of his own failure, of the supernova fizzling out, of his people being enslaved and tortured for eternity by the laughing, unseen enemy. The cold rage in his heart began to falter, the familiar, comforting sorrow seeping back in. He stumbled, his axe feeling impossibly heavy. It was then that Unit 734 Sigma acted. From its nexus in the apex spire, it focused its entire processing power into a single, desperate countermeasure. It could not fight the psychic assault, but it could speak to its soldiers. It broadcast a simple, undeniable truth directly into the command links of Bor Grundson's helm and the core programming of every remaining automaton. The message was not one of hope, but of pure data. A high-speed projection of the Drukhari slave ships in orbit, footage of the outer colonies being harvested, the sound of the kin's true screams of pain, not sorrow. It showed the smiling, cruel face of Lyrexis Malis, magnified 1,000 times. The truth cut through the psychic illusion like a razor. Bor Grundson's grief was burned away by the white-hot fire of a named Grudge. His people were not just dying, they were being consumed. he lifted his head and roared, a sound of pure, primal fury. There is the enemy. There is the source of our shame. We will not be their cattle. We will not be their art. We will be their doom. Fueled by this new, terrible purpose, he and his surviving hearthkin charged. They became a spearhead of righteous anger, punching through the mob. The automata, their programming now reinforced with the directive to annihilate hostile intelligence Xenos, rebooted and renewed their advance with brutal, unstoppable force. The battle for the soul of the Votann reached its climax at the Citadel gates, where the High Khal, a being of flesh and fury, finally met the High Grimnir, a prophet of spiritual death. Their clash would decide whether the sun would set on the Grendilian Compact, or if it would be torn from the sky in one final, defiant blaze of glory. The clash between High Khal Bor Grundson and High Grimnir Valia was not merely a duel of warriors. It was a battle for the soul of their race, fought on the precipice of annihilation. Valia did not wield a weapon of steel, but a pure, weaponized belief. As Bor Grundson charged, his plasma axe humming with incandescent rage, she met him with a psychic wave of absolute despair. The air grew heavy and cold around the High Khal. He saw not a crazed prophet before him, but the embodiment of all his failures. He saw the faces of the millions of kin he had led into this madness, their eyes accusing him. The dirge in his mind, which had been a dull echo, roared back to life, threatening to drown his newfound fury in a sea of crushing guilt. But Bor Grundson was no longer just a victim of the plague. He was the bearer of a grudge. The cold, logical data supplied by Unit 734 Sigma had forged an anchor of hatred in his soul that the sorrow could not wash away. "Your peace is a lie," he roared, forcing his legs to move through the psychic mire. "Your god is a Xenos parasite, and we are its feast." He swung his axe, not at Valia, but at the great stone lintel above the citadel gates, inscribed with the Votann rune for endurance. The ancient symbol shattered under the blow, and the act of defiance, of desecrating a symbol of their old life in the name of preserving it, seemed to momentarily break the Grimnir's concentration. The psychic pressure lessened, and Bor Grundson's hearthkin surged forward, laying down a storm of bolter fire that forced Valia and her coven back into the citadel's entrance hall. Inside, the battle became a desperate, close-quarters brawl. The remaining grief-sworn fanatics fought with the strength of the truly hopeless, while the crimson-eyed automata advanced with remorseless, mechanical brutality. Meanwhile, a team of Brokhire engineers, protected by a phalanx of ironkin, had reached their objective, the primary stellar regulation console. It was a vast, cathedral-like chamber, the air still humming with the ghost of unimaginable power. The engineers, their faces grim, set to their final, terrible task. They were not builders now, but decreators. They began to input the override sequences provided by 734 Sigma, their fingers flying across consoles that had been designed never to perform these functions. Safety interlocks were shattered with plasma torches. Coolant regulators were forcibly jammed open. The very soul of the Star Forge was being systematically violated, its life-preserving systems turned into instruments of suicide. A countdown appeared on the main holographic display, a single, stark timer showing 10 minutes until catastrophic overload. Valia saw it, and a look of transcendent horror crossed her face. This was not the gentle, dignified unmaking she had preached. This was a violent, screaming end, a defilement of their holy sorrow. "Blasphemers!" she shrieked, her psychic power lashing out in a final, desperate wave. The wave struck the overload console, and the Brokhire working it screamed as their minds were filled with the psychic agony of a dying star. They collapsed, their duty unfinished. Only Bor Grundson and Unit 734 Sigma's direct avatar, a heavily armored iron-kin praetor, were left. The final sequence requires manual activation from 3 separate terminals simultaneously, the praetor's synthesized voice stated, its form weathering a storm of psychic force that would have pulped a mortal mind. "I can activate one. You and your Thane must activate the others, High Khal." As Bor Grundson and Grum Varson fought their way to the remaining consoles, the star Grendel began to react. The silent forge ring began to groan and shudder. Beams of raw, untamed energy began to lance out from compromised conduits, carving fiery scars across the interior of the citadel. The countdown had stalled, but the process was now irreversible, a runaway reaction building to an unknown climax. Bor Grundson reached the final console just as Valia cornered him, her eyes glowing with white-hot psychic energy. "You will not profane our perfect end!" she screamed. He did not have time to fight her. He simply slammed his palm onto the activation rune, his gaze locked with hers. At the same instant, Grum activated his, and the iron-kin praetor completed the circuit. The effect was instantaneous. A soundless shockwave of pure energy erupted from the console, vaporizing Valia where she stood. A column of blinding white light shot up from the center of the citadel, piercing the bruised sky of Grendel Prime. The star Grendel, its delicate equilibrium shattered, began to collapse in on itself. From the agonized verse, Archon Lyrexis, Malise watched in stunned disbelief. His expression of smug appreciation curdled into one of rage and horror. This was not part of his symphony. This was a screeching, chaotic noise that was tearing his masterpiece apart. "Fools, savages, they are destroying the canvas," he shrieked. "Get us out of here. Retrieve what you can." The Drukhari fleet, caught completely by surprise, scrambled to escape. Slave ships, heavy with their cargo of souls, tried to power their drives, but it was too late. The supernova erupted. It was not a beautiful, blossoming fireball. It was a brutal, instantaneous wave of absolute destruction. A tsunami of hard radiation, electromagnetic energy, and raw psychic noise washed over the Grendel system. The psychic dirge, the constant, soul-crushing lament that had defined a civilization, was not faded. It was annihilated. It was like a single note being drowned out by the sound of the universe cracking open. In an instant, it was gone. But the price was catastrophic. The shockwave hit Grendel Prime, and the planet's atmosphere ignited. The surface was scoured to molten glass in seconds. The Apex Command Spire, with Unit 734 Sigma at its core, was vaporized in the first wave. Bor Grundson, his duty done, was granted the mercy of a death so swift he never perceived it. The inner planets were simply erased from existence. The Drukhari fleet was caught in the expanding hellstorm. Ships were torn apart, their shadow fields and esoteric defenses useless against the raw power of a dying star. Lyrexis's flagship, the agonized verse, was battered, its soul engines overloading as they were flooded with the psychic screams of the nova. He was forced to make an emergency, blind jump into the webway. His prize fleet in tatters. A significant portion of his harvested souls lost in the conflagration. The victory was absolute, and the cost was total. The lament plague was purged. The psychic link was severed. But the Grendel system was now a tomb. Its star, a rapidly expanding nebula of incandescent gas. The High Khal had saved his people's soul by sacrificing their world, their home, and his own life. It was a requiem written in stellar fire, a final, defiant roar that had silenced the aliens' song of sorrow. It was a Pyrrhic victory of truly galactic proportions across the shattered expanse of what was once the Grendelian Compact, trillions of minds awoke. The experience was not gentle. It was a violent, psychic whiplash. For months, their entire existence had been filtered through the suffocating veil of the dirge. Their thoughts, emotions, and motivations had been dictated by a singular, overwhelming sorrow. Then, in an instant of stellar fire, it was gone. The silence that rushed in was not peaceful. It was a terrifying, howling void. On Grendel Tertius, an agri-world far enough out to have survived the supernova's immediate blast, a Brokhire engineer stood frozen, a plasma cutter in his hand. A moment before, he had been methodically slicing through the support pylons of the planetary Vox array, a holy act in the great unmaking. Now, the divine purpose was gone, the beautiful sorrow replaced by a stark, horrifying clarity. He looked at the half-severed pylon, then at the cheering crowd of his fellow kin urging him on, and saw not a congregation, but a moor of vandals. He looked at his own hands and saw not the tools of a holy rite, but of a madman. The plasma cutter fell from his numb fingers, clattering on the ferrocrete. A single, guttural sob escaped his lips, the first true emotion he had felt in months. This scene was repeated 1,000,000 times over on every surviving ship, moon, and void station. The waking nightmare had begun. The collective consciousness of the Grendelian kin returned to find themselves standing in the ruins of their own home, their hands still holding the hammers that had brought it down. The psychological trauma was absolute and instantaneous. It was the realization of a sleepwalker awakening to find they have murdered their own family. The initial reaction was a wave of catatonic shock. Kin simply stood where they were, their minds unable to process the sheer scale of their actions. The silence from the ancestors was the most terrifying part. The constant, reassuring hum of data, which had been twisted into a dirge, was now gone entirely. The psychic link to their cores, severed by the supernova's blast, left them utterly alone in their own minds for the first time in their lives. It was a spiritual amputation of the highest order. They were adrift, orphans of their own gods. As the shock subsided, it was replaced by a tidal wave of horrified grief. This was not the false, placid sorrow of the plague, but the raw, jagged agony of genuine loss. The wailing that began on Grendel Tertius and echoed across the subsector was not a holy chant, but a scream of pure, undiluted pain. They wept for their dead Khal, for their silent ancestors, for their molten homeworld. They wept for their lost history, their scuttled fleets, their shattered future. But most of all, they wept for their own actions, for the willing, zealous desecration of their entire heritage. The shattered front was a scene of utter chaos. Fleets that had been en route to the graveyard orbit suddenly found themselves without orders, their crews breaking down on the bridges. Void stations, half dismantled, suffered catastrophic life support failures as their dazed inhabitants were unable to perform even the most basic repairs. The carefully orchestrated deconstruction gave way to a chaotic, cascading collapse. Amidst the anarchy, leaders began to emerge. They were not the ones who had held authority during the plague, but the survivors of the Iron Heresy, the few who had been fighting to preserve their civilization. Thane Grum Varson, who had been on a transport vessel just far enough away to survive the supernova's wrath, found his ship suddenly besieged by desperate vox hails from across the system. His small band of resistance fighters became the de facto rallying point for the sane. Their first actions were ones of brutal triage. They had to restore order, establish communications, and assess the damage. The truth was worse than they could have imagined. Grendel Prime was gone. The first cog was gone. The High Call and the entire Hearth Varl were gone. Their industrial heartland was an expanding nebula. Their core fleet was a field of cold debris. The outer colonies, they soon discovered, were eerily silent, their populations having vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faint energy signature of Xenos vessels. The psychological toll was immense. Many kin, unable to bear the guilt of what they had done, simply took their own lives, completing the work the plague had started. Others descended into a true, directionless madness, their minds shattered by the psychic whiplash. But for most, the grief began to slowly, painstakingly, curdle into something else. As the reports of the vanished outer colonies came in, as the evidence of a deliberate external attack became undeniable, their sorrow found a new focus. It was the first step on a long, dark road, as the unendurable weight of their guilt began to transform into the unbreakable resolve of a grudge. The waking nightmare was ending, and in its place, a cold, vengeful dawn was breaking in the twisted, non-Euclidean heart of Comorag. The news of the Grendel cataclysm was received not as a defeat, but as a triumph of a new and daring form of art. Archon Lyrexus, Mali's, his flagship, the agonized verse. Limping back to its spire dock, its hull scarred by stellar fire, and its lower decks echoing with the psychic screams of dying soul engines, found himself the celebrated master of the Dark City. He had not returned with the vast haul of slaves he had promised, nor with the full bounty of psychic energy he had harvested. A significant portion of his fleet was lost, a fact that would have doomed a lesser Archon to the knives of his rivals. But Lyrexus had brought back something far more valuable. He presented himself before the grand Kabbalite conclaves, not as a humbled commander, but as a visionary artist. In vast, shimmering crystal tanks, his homunculi displayed the core essence of the lament plague. It was a roiling, semi-sentient cloud of pure misery, the distilled, psychic death scream of the Grendelian ancestor. Cores, captured in the final moments before the supernova had scoured them from existence. It was a weapon of conceptual annihilation, a testament to his genius. He had proven that even the most stoic, logical, and resilient race in the galaxy could be turned into an instrument of its own destruction through the masterful application of sorrow. The other Archons, beings who prized cruelty and psychological torment above all else, looked upon his work with a mixture of envy and awe. Lyrexus had elevated their craft. "I have shown you that a fleet can be shattered without firing a single shot," he declared to the assembly, his voice dripping with condescending pride. "I have proven that an empire can be brought to its knees, not with armies, but with an idea." The Grendelian Compact was but a provincial gallery, a test of my new medium. Now I seek a grander canvas, a canvas of 10,000 worlds, whose faith is already a brittle, cracked thing. A canvas known as the Imperium of Man. Whispers of a new war, a war of tears, began to circulate through the shadowy alleys and opulent spires of the dark city. Cabals began to vie for the honor of acquiring a sliver of the lament plague's essence, seeking to replicate Lyrexus's methods on their own chosen victims. The Grendel cataclysm had not been an end. It had been a proof of concept. A new and terrible age of psychological warfare was dawning. Meanwhile, in the Materium, the aftershocks of the cataclysm spread through the Votann leagues. The first to arrive in the Grendel system were prospecting fleets from the neighboring Trans-Hyperion Alliance, a powerful and notoriously mercantile league. They had come expecting to capitalize on the sudden, inexplicable silence from their trading partners. They found not a thriving empire, but a tomb, a newborn nebula where a star should be, a ghost system of shattered rocks, and a handful of traumatized survivors clinging to the wreckage of their civilization. The initial reaction was one of shock and horror. But as the survivors, led by Thane Grum Varson, tried to explain what had happened, a psychic plague a sorrowful crusade, a self-triggered supernova, the story was met with disbelief, which quickly hardened into suspicion, and then contempt. To the pragmatic kin of the Trans-Hyperion Alliance, the tale was illogical, insane. A more plausible and far more damning narrative quickly took hold. The Grendelian Compact, their reasoning went, must have delved into some forbidden technology. Their ancestor cores, perhaps failing or senile, must have led them astray. In their arrogance, they had committed the ultimate sin. They had destroyed their own cores, including a primary core as ancient as the first cog. They had become ancestor killers. This was not a tragedy. It was the gravest of all possible heresies. The brand of ancestor killer spread like a virus. The survivors of Grendel were declared outcasts, their ships denied docking rights, their hails for aid ignored. Trade sanctions were levied not just against the survivors, but against any who offered them sanctuary. The other leagues, fearing a similar madness, might be contagious, or that associating with the Grendelian survivors would bring ill fortune, shunned them. A bitter, cold civil war began, not of open conflict, but of isolation and condemnation. The Grendelian survivors were pariahs. Their legitimate grudge against the Drukhari ignored by their own kind in favor of a new internal grudge against them for their perceived heresy. Thane Grum Varson and the nascent Council of Survivors found themselves utterly alone. They had saved the soul of their people, only to be cast out by them. Their pleas for help in hunting the shadowkin who had done this were dismissed as the ravings of madmen trying to cover their own crimes. They were a people without a home, without allies, and without the guidance of their ancestors. The victory of the Starbreaker Gambit had set the stage for a new, even more terrible conflict, a war for their own identity and survival against the judgment of their entire race. The whispers of a new war were not just in Komorach. They were now in the embittered hearts of every surviving kin of the Grendelian Compact. In the cold, uncaring void, adrift amidst the ghosts of their former glory, the survivors of the Grendelian Compact faced a choice: fade into obscurity as a cautionary tale whispered by other leagues, or be reforged into something new and terrible. The scorn of their kin, the branding of ancestor killer, was a heavier blow than any Drukhari weapon. It was a spiritual poison that threatened to finish the work the Lament Plague had started. But where the plague had offered the false peace of sorrow, the condemnation of their own kind ignited a different, harder emotion, a cold, logical fury. The consolidation took place in the shadow of a dead moon, the only celestial body in the outer Grendel system to have survived the supernova relatively intact. Here, the ragged remnants of the Grendilian fleet gathered, a sad collection of mining haulers, prospecting frigates, and the few warships that had been on the system's periphery. It was here, in a hastily converted ore-processing hangar, lit by the eerie glow of the Grendel Nebula, that Thane Grum Varson called the Council of the Grudge Zuo. Worn. He stood before the assembled ship captains, Brokire masters, and the few Grimnir whose minds had not shattered completely. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a new, chilling light. They call us ancestor killers. His voice, amplified by the hangar's vox, was gravelly and raw. They are correct. We killed the ancestors they knew. We killed the sick, poisoned things they had become, to save the truth of what they were. We have no home. We have no allies. The great leagues have cast us out. They leave us with nothing. He paused, letting the weight of their isolation settle in the vast, cold chamber. Nothing but the grudge. He raised a single, scarred fist. The shadow kin of the void violated us. They turned our reverence into a weapon and our home into a pyre. That is a debt that must be paid in blood and ruin. The other leagues, in their arrogant ignorance, have laid a grudge upon us for our survival. That is a debt that will be recorded in silence and stone, to be settled when the first is done. We are no longer the Grendilian Compact. The Compact was a league of builders. Our work now is not to build, but to dismantle our enemies. From this day forward, we are the Grief Sworn. The name resonated with the broken kin. It acknowledged their loss, their sorrow, but twisted it into a promise of vengeance. It was a banner under which they could unite their shame and their rage. A grim cheer, more a growl than a shout, echoed through the hangar. The Grendilian Compact was dead. The Grief-Sworn were born. Their society was immediately and brutally restructured for a single purpose: war. Every prospecting vessel was refitted, its seismic charges replaced with macro cannons, and its survey sensors repurposed for targeting arrays. Every mining laser became a ship-to-ship lance. They were no longer a balanced society of artisans, miners, and warriors. They were a nomadic war fleet, a privateer league fueled by vengeance. Their most crucial asset, and their most painful reminder, was the fragmented data recovered from Unit 734, Sigma's last broadcast. Before its annihilation, the ancient Ironkin had transmitted everything it had deduced: the profile of the Drukhari fleet, the nature of the psychic attack, and most importantly, a partial trace of the agonized verse's emergency webway jump. This data became their sacred text, their only guide in a universe without ancestors. A new class of Brokhire, the data scryers, emerged, their sole purpose to sift through these last remnants of their savior machine, seeking any clue that would lead them to their enemy. Lacking an ancestor core, they became reliant on a new, silent oracle, the Ironkin. Praetor, the last known avatar of 734 Sigma's will to survive the supernova, was installed in the command throne of Grum Varson's flagship, the newly christened Indomitable Grudge. The Praetor was silent, its cognitive functions likely damaged, but its presence was a potent symbol. It was the last link to the cold, hard logic that had saved them. The Grief-Sworn would consult it before every raid, interpreting its minor movements or the flicker of its optical sensors as omens and guidance. It was a silent, steel god for a people who had lost their faith in their old ones. The Grief-Sworn began their hunt. They became ghosts of the void, their ships running cold and silent, their methods brutal and efficient. They haunted the fringes of the galaxy, falling upon any Xenos raiders they could find, interrogating survivors with a cold, relentless cruelty that would have horrified their former selves. They were not seeking territory or wealth. They were seeking information. Every raid was a search for whispers of a cabal that prized sorrow, of an archon who styled himself an artist. They became a dark legend among the kin. Other leagues would occasionally find the drifting, shattered remnants of Orc, Kroot, or Eldar Corsair fleets, their hulls marked with a single stark rune, the shattered symbol of endurance, the Grendilian crest, now repurposed as the mark of the Grief-Sworn. They were a fleet fueled by a cold logical fury, a people who had lost everything and now had nothing left to lose. Their sole purpose, their reason for enduring their shame, was to hunt down Archon Lyrexus, Malise, and teach him the true meaning of despair. The Grendel system became a scar on the star charts, a place of ill omen and cosmic horror. The beautiful, expanding nebula that had been its heart was named the Ancestors' Lament by the few voidfarers who dared to pass near its edges. It served as a silent, incandescent tombstone for a civilization, a monument not to a battle, but to a masterpiece of sorrow. Within the wider leagues of Votann, the story of the Grendel cataclysm was twisted into a cautionary tale, a dark myth used to frighten young kin and caution ambitious khals. It spoke of the dangers of pride, of technological heresy, and of ancestor cores that could go mad, conveniently omitting the role of an external enemy. The name Grendel became synonymous with shame and folly. The balance of power in the subsector, once anchored by the industrial might of the compact, was irrevocably shattered. The Trans-Hyperion Alliance, first to condemn the survivors, was also the first to capitalize on their absence. They greedily absorbed the old Grendelian trade routes and client worlds, growing rich and powerful on the ashes of their disgraced cousins. This act of cold, pragmatic opportunism planted a deep and bitter seed. The Grudge. The grief sworn held against the other leagues was no longer just for their condemnation, but for the dishonorable profiting from their tragedy. In the dark city of Comorra, Archon Lyrexus Malis reached an unprecedented height of power and influence. The Lament Plague was his enduring legacy. Though he had lost a fleet and a significant portion of his initial harvest, the conceptual victory was absolute. He became the master of a new school of warfare, the path of the weeping soul. Cabals and covens paid him fortunes for even a fragment of his knowledge, for the secrets of breaking a society's spirit rather than its armies. He began his great work on a new, more ambitious project, his gaze fixed firmly on the weak points of the Imperium. The tragedy of the Votann was merely the overture. The true symphony of suffering was yet to be composed. But his victory was not without its flaw. A ghost now haunted his footsteps, a rumor that even the labyrinthine corridors of Comorra could not entirely stifle. Whispers spoke of a fleet of silent, vengeful kin, of Drukhari raiding parties that went missing on the fringes of real space, leaving behind only distorted vox screams and the cold, accusing mark of a shattered rune. Lyrexus dismissed it as the fantasy of lesser rivals. He could not conceive that the broken remnants of his greatest artwork would have the will or the means to seek retribution. It was an oversight born of arrogance, a loose thread in his perfect tapestry that would one day begin to unravel. The ultimate legacy was the one carried by the grief-sworn themselves. They became a new and terrifying force in the galaxy. They were a league without an ancestor core, a people guided not by the wisdom of the past, but by the singular, burning imperative of a grudge. This profound change altered their very nature. They abandoned the traditions of measured profit and careful expansion. Their Brokhire became masters of weaponizing scavenged technology. Their Hearthkin became relentless hunters, versed in the arts of ambush and terror tactics. Their few remaining Grimnir turned their psychic talents inward, not to hear the whispers of ancestors, but to listen for the psychic echoes of their enemies, becoming hounds that could scent sorrow on the stellar winds, led by the grim Votann Varson, now styled the Grudge Keeper, and advised by the silent, motionless iron-kin praetor upon their command throne. They plied the dark spaces between the stars. They were a fleet of ghosts, forever bound to their loss. The concept of the infallibility of the ancestor. Cores, the bedrock of Votann society for millennia, was broken, and the grief-sworn were the living proof. Their existence was a seed of doubt and fear planted in the heart of every Votann, a silent question about the true nature of their machine gods. And so, the epic concluded. A civilization was erased, its legacy one of ash and a chilling warning. A dark artist in a shadowy city was lauded for his masterpiece, unaware that his creation had spawned its own vengeful antibodies. And a new legend was born. The Grief-Sworn, a nomadic fleet of kinsmen who had endured the ultimate sorrow and emerged from the fire not broken, but tempered into a weapon of cold, logical, and unending fury. Their war was far from over. It had just begun. The universe had taught them a lesson in despair. And now they would travel the stars to repay that lesson in blood.